very southwest of Germany, in a city that had like 120,000 people. It was the only city nearby. Everything else was villages. So I'm sort of a city kid. The environment in my hometown, Saarbrücken, which is near Luxembourg, if that helps a little, and very close to the French border, was pretty Catholic in a way. My parents were Protestant, and in those days religion and Catholicism did play a certain role in day-to-day life. So I was kind of a slight outsider in the environment where I grew up. And most people were sort of conservative there, and I didn't, especially when I became a teenager and I let my hair grow in the early 70s. It wasn't so super easy to get along with other people. I mean, I had big sympathy for the hippie movement in those days. I'm born in 1959, so I was 13 in 72. And yeah, I liked there was only one show on television that had rock and roll music at all, and that was on like once a month. And I was pretty fascinated by, even when I was a kid, I was pretty fascinated with bands like the Kings and the Rolling Stones, not because I really understood their music at that point. I understood that it was kind of wild and it was really appealing to me, but I also liked their looks. They looked a little bit like people from outer space with their weird haircuts and so on, and I liked those aesthetics. When I adopted these aesthetics, as I said, I was sort of an outsider, and I was looking for friends. I mean, in my class there were some other boys who also liked that kind of music, and we were a small group of people who went to concerts. In those days, you know, there was, in my hometown, there was like one concert a month, maybe, sometimes even less. And so it was a big event, and I went there, and yeah, I totally liked this not conservative environment. And at some point I decided, oh yeah, it would be nice to make music myself. Thankfully, my parents were very supportive. Like they asked me at some point, Kristof, you want to maybe play an instrument? And I said, yeah, I'd love to. They said, okay, but please don't pick the drums, the trumpet, or the violin, because this is just too nerve-wracking. And I decided, okay, I'm going to pick the guitar. I was also into songwriters. Like at that point, I started to realize what different kinds of music there were, and I really liked Bob Dylan and Leonard Cohen. In those days, singer-songwriters. Later on, I turned to prog rock, because most bands that played in my hometown in that period were prog rock bands. I remember seeing King Crimson in 1975, Van der Graaf Generator, and I'm a big Peter Hamill fan. So, and gradually I was turned on to Glam Rock, which also came up in those days, like Roxy Music. I remember a TV show in my hometown when it was called Musikladen, and they had there was the first time on German television that, you know, after the late news there was an extra show, TV show. They had the regular TV show on at 9 o'clock, and Roxy Music played one song, and then after the late news they had a whole live set of Roxy Music during the the second album, For Your Pleasure period. And I watched that and I was blown away. I was absolutely fascinated. And that, in combination with the upcoming punk movement and new wave movement in 1977, made me realize, actually maybe I could play some music too, because the prog rock stuff I didn't really decipher, and I thought I had to be a much better musician I was studying classical guitar in those days, but I thought I have to be a much better musician. I'm never gonna get that good. So when punk rock came along and it was pretty much everybody can do everything, I thought, wow, that's interesting. And I moved to Munich in 1977 to study there, and one of the first shows that I saw in Munich, I think it was November 21st or 22nd, 1977. I know that because I had the poster hanging on my wall at home. I saw Blondie at the downtown in Munich, and Debbie Harry just blew me away. I was also I started getting into the New York music scene, no wave and New York punk rock, and also the Velvet Underground. I became a fan of Lou Reed and John Cale, and the Ramones, and all the weird New York stuff like DNA, the Ray Beats, James Chance, all that stuff. And at the same time in Germany, there were lots of experimental bands coming up. So, and I found some like-minded friends in Munich in those days, and we formed a band. And it's and like in 1980, I saw lots of shows in Munich because there were more shows going on, and then I decided to move to Berlin in 1980, and that was another step forward, because through my friends I met the owner of one of the first punk record stores in Germany, Censor. He also had a label, Censor Records, and I got a job there, working in the record store. First I was doing the mail order, packing packages, doing the mail order stuff, and later on I worked in the shop. The band that I discovered at that point was the Cramps, and they sort of really changed my attitude again towards more rediscovering rock and roll music and rockabilly, which I still find very appealing. And I must say, in my hometown, there was no rock and roll music on the radio. It was just bullshit, disco or Schlager or classical music. I mean, classical music I like, but nothing for a teenager, you know. So kind of stupid, not stupid. So yeah, the other, I mean, I was not proletarian enough to be a punk rocker. It would have been dishonest to say, I'm punk rock, because for me that did imply a proletarian background, and my background is kind of bourgeois, as you might hear from my from the words I use, terminology. In my school days, I also read a lot of Karl Marx and stuff. I was in these communist splinter groups, like every other week another splinter group, from Maoists to Trotskyists to whatever. And at some point I settled for nihilistic individual anarchism of Max Stirner, which is like some pre-Nietzschean individualism. So yeah, and I read, I was pretty impressed by Franz Kafka, which is, which fit like Joy Division. You read Franz Kafka and then you hear She Lost Control again. Everything just fits together really nicely. That's how it came to be. And yeah, and that was at some point mixed with a rockabilly attitude. I thought that Suicide were a super fascinating band. I was a huge fan of these guys, and Per Ubu. I like the aspect of an eclectic aspect of just grabbing stuff and using it, making it your own, steal stuff here and there and there and there, and put it in a different context, and hopefully make it entertaining to a certain degree. I must also say, in the early 80s in Berlin, the music scene was a little bit different than it is nowadays. Nowadays everything's pretty professional. Like bands go on stage and they have Evian water with them. In the 80s, you didn't do that. I mean, you took a bottle of whiskey on stage and you drank it, and you got totally fucked up, and the audience was fucked up, and everybody had a good time. Which is not too healthy in the long run, but it was fun, really great fun at the time. I would not necessarily recommend that to my children, but who am I to tell them what to do or not to do? I mean, they're grown up nowadays. So yeah, I also while I was working at the record store in Berlin, there was a guy who I knew from the shows that I was going to. He came into the store and he told me that he had opened a bar, or he had bought a bar, and at some point I started working at that bar. It was called the Risiko. Blixer Bargeld was also working there, and the bar opened at 10, but people would drop by at around midnight, and it would stay open until the very end, when nobody could stand anymore, or so. And that was a super cool bar, because like most bands who played in Berlin, like from that scene, they came to drink at the Risiko after their shows. So it was constantly crowded with musicians from out of town. It was constantly crowded with musicians from Berlin anyway, and who also dropped by were people who worked in other bars that closed earlier. So like for, I don't know, 5-6 years, I did not have to pay to get into shows, and I did not have to pay for drinks when I went to other bars. I had a pretty, I must say, I'm a pretty lucky person. And I had an enjoyable life so far. I had the first bands I had in Berlin were experimental, more or less, and then I formed a band with some friends who were into 60s trash garage bands, B, C, and D movies, like, you know, trash culture, comic books, and weird literature in general. So that is the conglomerate of influences that I was dealing with. Then in 1989, one of the people who hung out at Risiko was a young drummer from Brooklyn who lived in Berlin at the time for several years because he had a girlfriend there. His name was Vinny Signorelli, and he moved back to New York. And in 1989, I was invited to play the South by Southwest Festival in Austin, Texas. And I thought, okay, I'm not gonna go directly to Austin. I'm gonna go to New York and then to Austin. And there I met Vinny, and he had a band that on the day when I arrived had a jam session, and I joined them, and it was great fun to play with those guys. The next day, Vinny Signorelli went to an audition with Swans, who were looking for, who were at that point just Michael Jarboe and Norman. That was the Burning World. After they had recorded the Burning World, and they were looking for musicians, and they hired Vinny Signorelli, and they asked him, we're looking for a guitar player, do you know a guy? And he said, well, I just played with a dude last night, he would fit perfectly. And they told him, well, go and ask him. And he did, and like I was on my way to Texas at that point, and I said, well, if they still need a guitar player in 2 weeks, I'll give it a shot. And there I met Michael, who was sort of impressed by the fact that I could play classical guitar. You know, if you want to impress somebody, just play some Bach. And who was also impressed by the fact that I, at the time, was translating a book by one of his favorite writers, Hubert Selby Jr. Because that was my job at the time, and it still is. I translate books from English to German, and he thought that was pretty fascinating and interesting that I did that. So we got along fine intellectually, and I joined the band, and the rest is history, more or less. I dropped out of the band in 1992 because my wife at the time was pregnant, and I could, and there were we started a tour, and during the first half of the tour there were some complications with her pregnancy, and I told Michael, I can't do the second half. I'm going to finish the first half, but I'm not going to do the second half. He was not happy with that, but we stayed friends. He understood it, but he was not happy with it. And like in '98, I think, I got a phone call from his manager saying, Michael is forming a new band called Angels of Light. And he asked me if you would like to be in that band. And I said, yeah, of course. And that's how we started working with each other again. So I recorded I played on most Angels of Light records, except like one in the middle where he had Edwyn Family as a backing band. And like, I remember when we recorded the last Angels of Light album, We Are Him, I sensed that he was maybe going back into the direction of Swans again. So I wasn't super surprised when he called me in, 2009, saying, Kristof, I want to make loud music again, would you be up for that? And I said, oh yeah, totally, why not? And he said, and I want to call it Swans, what do you think about that? Excellent. Did you ask Norman or Algis? And said, okay, that's so, but yeah, he talked to Norman, and so in February 2010 we started recording new Swans material. And originally, I think it was planned as a project to go on for a year or two, but it gained such a momentum that we kept going for 8 years, all in all, which was great fun, but super hard work. We played 150 shows a year. 2.5-hour shows at very high volume, and so it made me sort of a pretty calm person. You go on stage and you're louder than a brontosaurus when he farts, and or louder than a jet engine. And you just feel so incredibly powerful, so you don't have to be aggressive or you don't have to prove anything. You can be just a gentle person, which hopefully I am nowadays. Yeah, besides that, I had some more rock and roll oriented bands in Berlin in the meantime. One was called Les Hommes Sauvages, which was a band that had 2 singers, me and a woman, Viola Limpid, and we sang we called the music rock and roll noir. We sang in German, French and English. It was song-oriented material played in a pretty elegant way, which is another sort of aesthetics that I kind of appreciate. Nothing beats a really nice rock and roll song, or hardly anything. yeah, so, and now I also, like, while we were touring with Swans, I work a lot with loops, the steel guitar and loops, and I found out, wow, this is actually pretty satisfying to make some sort of ambient, droney music. I really got into that. So that's what I also do nowadays. I would call it, satanistic meditation music. I'm not a Satanist, just joking. Yeah, it's the sound of continental shelves, like rubbing against each other, but also, I like the sound of birds in the trees. I like the sound of wind. I like the sound of the waves. I really enjoy being by the seaside in a deserted area, or an area where there's not too many people and you don't hear any man-made noises, for instance. It's just the wind, the waves, and the birds, the insects, whatever. This is nowadays what I listen to. What intention do I put into my music? Wow. That, okay. The music, like when I make music on my own, I want to make some music that I would like to hear and that nobody does, or that, it's the music I'm missing, that I think is missing out there in the world. I want to make something that entertains myself and that I think is substantial. I want to enjoy it. I want to create a sonic environment that I find pleasing in whatever way I consider pleasing at that point. But I do want to make people happy, or feel sad maybe, But in general, it is. I want to hear something. I want to make something that I would like to hear at that moment, and it's for me, like, the more ambient stuff is more, creating a sonic sculpture. Music is molecules of air shaken, and I want them to shake in a certain way so that they take on certain shapes. Sometimes I have images in my head, like of swarms of birds, or jellyfish drifting in the ocean, and that kind of, or clouds shaping, all that kind of stuff. It's pretty visual in a certain way, at least my instrumental music. And it's also, like, some of it is planned beforehand, some of it is just, I start with a note and a sound, and it's like, where does that take me? What can I add? What does it sound like? How does it develop? It's like, and where does it take me? So I follow certain paths, and in the end, I'm pretty surprised of what comes out. That's the solo stuff. also, like, when I play with other musicians like Swans or Sauvage and or Sultans of Gedankenbrain, my band at home, it is the interaction between people. What happens if there's certain people in a room who create something, and what comes into existence? What takes on? What shapes does it take on? Like, as I said, in my brain, it's all music is all shapes or colors sometimes.
Yeah,
sometimes even smells and tastes.
Let's do a funky gun dance. Shop. The range reduced, she didn't cost a lot. I spent my rent on guaranteed fun. I wrapped her up, I took her home, caressed her when I was alone. She and me and my gun, me and my gun, me and my gun, me and my gun. The uniform I used to wear, it's in the wardrobe over there. Keeps calling me, come on and put me on. Well, we go out sometimes at night. We're so excited, such a sight. We're number one. Me and my gun. Me and my gun. Me and my gun, 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 me and my gun. Sometimes I shoot up in the air. Sometimes I wish that there's someone up there. 'Cause if there is, you know, I don't care. Sometimes we go out late at night. We're so excited, such a sight. We're number one. Me and my gun, 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 me and my gun. Audience participation part. Now you also all sing along. Me and my gun. Can't you sing that? Me and my gun. Me and my gun. Me and my gun. Once more. Freedom. The absence of being told what to do, or that is a really tough question. I mean, usually freedom implies to be free of something, like free to be free of oppression or orders and whatsoever. It can also mean to be free to do something. So for me, yeah, it's a combination of these two, like to be free of repression, blah 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 blah, blah and orders, and to be free to do things that I'd like to do. And to have choices, to have lots of choices.
Freedom is in possibilities.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing is, everything you do, every action you take is the death of a million possibilities. So I feel very privileged, and in certain ways as a white person in the Western world, you enjoy a lot of freedom. My passport gives me the freedom to go pretty much everywhere. Whereas if I had a passport from Senegal or whatever, I couldn't do that. So freedom pretty much means to me to be able to physically move to places that I want to go or want to see. Also, of course, to read the books that I want to read, and to listen to the music I can listen to. There was a time in Germany where you couldn't just read any book you liked, or where you couldn't say anything, or where you couldn't just say what you wanted to say. So freedom of speech, for instance, or freedom to think whatever you want to think. That is, the thing. But to quote Chris Christopherson, it's just another word for nothing left to lose. That's also freedom. It's kind of difficult, too difficult for me to answer that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you guys. I enjoyed this totally.
That's great.
Yeah, I hope I wasn't good.
Okay.
All right.